To develop both of these, I make use of a further insight provided by a traditional African culture, that of the Sara of Chad, as discussed by the ethnologist Lucien Scubla in the context of his hypothesis with respect to the central role of the imagery of spilt blood, as the analog of that of menstrual blood in the ritual ceremony of initiation or of symbolic birth of traditional Africa. For the Sara, Skubla points out, the meaning of the ritual of initiation is based on a binary opposition between two kinds of birth, i.e., natural birth, of which the women are the bearers, and cultural birth, of which only the men can be the procreators. Because for them, it is only through the second birth that full humanhood can be attained. The function of the ritual is to transform beings who are animals with the human vocation into humans, so that where, for the cultural belief system of the Judeo-Christian West in its now purely secularized form, degrees of true humanhood are equated with one's ostensible degrees of bioevolutionary selectedness, with the scale of humanness therefore being based on the binary code of eugenicity/dysgenicity, for the Serah, true humanhood is attained to through the process of cultural socialization. One of the high points of this process, the ritual of initiation, is therefore represented as analogous to the transformative process of cooking, where in the latter process, the men who are hunters give the raw meat that they have killed to the women, who then render it edible for human consumption. In the transformative process of initiation, or of symbolic birth as it pertains to males, the women hand over the raw male adolescents to the men so that they can be ritually killed and engorged by the ancestors in order to be mimetically reborn through a series of ritual ordeals as members of the clan. Central to this transformative process, therefore, is a value principle which is drawn by the Sirah between the positively marked blood spilt by the male either as hunter, the blood of the hunt, or as sacrificer, the blood of sacrifice, and its founding yet binary analog, the menstrual blood of the female. This is therefore a value principle that is central, in my own terms, to the enacting of Grassi's governing code. Both of the former, i.e., the blood spilt by the hunter and the spilt blood of sacrifice in the religious rites presided over by the men, are therefore positively marked as signs of symbolic life-giving activity. They are thereby valorized as cooked or true life as contrasted with the raw or uncooked life given birth to by the women. And although Skubla does not discuss this aspect, the ceremony of female initiation provided over by older women should function according to the same principle of value transformation. My proposal here is that the institution of initiation, or of symbolic birth, should be seen in the terms of the Serah's conception as one of the matrix social inventions founding to all human forms of life, to therefore their poiesis of being and co-related modes of symbolically coded rather than genetically programmed eusociality. The invention, therefore, of their con-specific identity as, in the case of the Sarah, members of the clan, rather than as members of a biological species or subspecies. In this context, the institution of initiation based on the semantic charter or morphogenetic fantasy of the binary code of symbolic life/biological life and the value principle enacted by its positive/negative series of representations can therefore be recognized as a central harmonizing mechanism by means of which what Antonio de Nicolas defines as the transmutation of genetic into symbolic identity, of theory into flesh, is effected. By means of which, therefore, the now initiated young male adolescent is enabled to phenomenologically experience himself as the symbolic conspecific of those initiated and socialized with him in the terms of the same code, with this new experiencing of the self thereby inducing him to display altruistic co-identifying behaviors towards his age group peers, within the terms of a mode of eusociality, that is, that of a clan, as a mode of eusociality which, like that of our contemporary nation-state mode of conspecificity, is a culture systemically rather than genetically ordered. In other words, the order of the social, as Kubla further points out, is itself born from the spilt blood of the religious sacrificial rites presided over by the men. Since it is this rite which marks the passage from the order of purely biological life, negatively marked as the sign of sterile disorder in the origin myths of traditional societies, as in the case of a Dinka origin myth as well as of an Amerindian myth of the origin of tobacco that Skubla gives as examples, to the order of human societies that is founding to our uniquely symbolic forms of life. While, as he further shows, an indispensable condition of this founding is that the negative/positive binary opposition pointed to by the Sirah of Chad between, on the one hand, the biological or natural life given by the woman, whose signifier is that of the image of menstrual blood, and on the other hand, the cultural life or symbolic birth given to by the men, whose analogical micro-signifiers are the blood spilt by the hunter and even more centrally by the spilt blood of the religious rite of sacrifice, must be law-likely kept in place and maintained at all levels of the specific social order and form of life, as is also the case, therefore, with respect to the systematic nature of the negatively marked representation of Black Africa and of the peoples of Black African descent by the scholarly, cinematic, and social texts of the contemporary West. My tea bag. The symbolic coding imperative is clear in the two examples that are given by Skubla, that of the Dinka origin narrative and that of the tobacco origin myth of the Terreno Arawaks, but perhaps it is most transparent in the latter. In the latter's plot line, as Skubla shows, a woman who is a sorceress attempts to poison her husband with her menstrual blood, the symbol of biological life/birth. Warned by his son, the husband goes in search of honey, mixes it with the embryos of a pregnant snake which he has killed, and gives it to the woman to eat. Eating it, she is transformed into a man-eating ogress. While chasing her husband to devour him, she falls into a pit and dies, where she dies and spills her blood. A hitherto unknown plant, the tobacco plant, sprouts up from the ground. Her husband collects the leaves, cures them, then ritually smokes them in the company of his male peers, who are collectively, in the terms of the myth, the procreators of true symbolic life as against the mere biological life given birth to by the women. As they ritually smoke, the smoke ascends as incense to the gods. The constant here is that the plot line of the narrative can be seen to pivot on the same systems of negatively/positively marked representations, whose binary evil/good oppositions will be performatively enacted as the passage of disorder to order in the ceremony of symbolic birth that is founding to traditional societies. The woman, Skubla writes, is accused of poisoning her husband with her menstrual blood. The myth then leads from menstrual blood, which flows downwards, a natural privilege of women, but a privilege marked negatively, to the tobacco smoke, which rises upward, as the cultural privilege of the men, which is marked positively, that is to say, from the signifier of procreation to the signifier of religion. The transformative passage in both narrative and ritual ceremony is therefore one from the signifier of the procreation of biological life in whose terms behaviors of bonding altruism are restricted to their genetic limits. To the signifier of the cultural procreation of symbolic life, in which degrees of bonding altruism will be induced and motivated by the new directive signs of the narratively inscribed code. Here, the representation system of the myth, together with the cooked/raw tobacco smoke/menstrual blood code of symbolic life and death that it enacts, functions as the parallel drawn by the Sirah reveals, according to the same negative/positive opposition on whose basis the ceremony of symbolic birth presided over by the male procreators is effected. Since it is by means of both that the subjects of the order are induced to experience their biological beings in symbolically coded terms, and to thereby transfer allegiance and kinship loyalty from their genetic to their culturally instituted conspecifics, from the siblings of the womb to those of the clan. In our own case, to those of the class, of the nation-state, of the ethno-religious group, the race. From here, the imperative nature of the way in which the representation of biological identity must be negatively marked at all levels, since it is this negative marking that induces the aversive behavioral response on the part of the subjects of each other to the otherwise overriding imperative of their genetic identity. This, at the same time as the positively marked representation of their artificial identity, serves to induce desire for and allegiance to the culture-specific criterion of being which it encodes. For the Sirah of Chad, therefore, the category of the life to which the women give rise had to be as negatively marked, i.e., as brute or raw life, as was the sign of menstrual blood, of which the woman is the bearer in the Terreno myth, given that both must now function as signifiers of symbolic death, of sterility, to the fecundity of symbolic life. Looked at transculturally, the image of menstrual blood can be identified as the image enacting of the origin model of procreation that is specific to societies of the agrarian era whose polytheistic religions had divinized nature and the natural forces. Its macro image of origin was, however, to be increasingly displaced by the rise of the monotheistic religions whose new origin model of creation would, by its de-godding or de-divinizing of nature, replace the menstrual blood or origin signifier with those of the macro-textual signifiers, as in the case of original sin of their respective faiths. As Scuba's analysis of the Terreno myth therefore makes clear, the binary value opposition between order/full being and the lack of full being, i.e., the positively marked tobacco smoke rising upwards, and disorder, i.e., the negatively marked menstrual blood flowing downwards, enacts the ontological rationale of a code in which the category of women are the bearers/signifiers of raw biological life, and that of men, the procreators/creators of cooked symbolic life, or culture. This, however, should not be seen as an effect of what we have come to define as patriarchy, and thereby interrupted in terms of the feminist paradigm as an empirical opposition between men and women. Rather, what is at issue here is an opposition that makes use of the physiological difference between the two sexes in order to inscript and enact Grassi's governing code in agrarian polytheistic terms. This is the same way as, I shall propose here, in our contemporary industrial order, and thereby in the terms of the now purely secularized variant of the Judeo-Christian culture of the West, the physiognomically different categories of two population groups, that of, on the one hand, the Indo-Europeans, and of, on the other, the Bantu Africans, are deployed as the central means of the enacting of the governing code instituting of our present conception of the human, man, with Africa thereby having to be represented in the terms of this code by both the cinematic and scholarly texts of the West as the abode and origin of the human other. This, at the same time as all peoples of African descent must be negatively represented within the logic of our present conception of being, man, as brute or uncooked life, as contrasted with the cooked or symbolic life signified by the West and embodied in all peoples of Indo-European descent, who must therefore be canonized as such by means of a positively marked system of representation. Whether within the terms of the pre-industrial origin narrative of Africa, as well as in that of the Amerindian myth of the origin of tobacco, or in that of the origin model of evolution or official creation story of the contemporary techno-industrial culture of the West, the negatively marked categories, that of the woman of the first two, and that of the peoples of African descent of the third, are imperative to the process by means of which the governing code of symbolic life and its verbally inscripted directive signs can be made to override the directive signs of the biological aspect of human forms of life and modes of being. That is, as an aspect which, although the indispensable condition of our experiencing ourselves in culture-specific terms of this or that mode of the human, must itself be systematically devalued by being negatively marked. Given that if, as the linguist Lieberman points out, the human is defined by two levels of conspecific altruism, that of the organic level determined by our degrees of genetic kinship, and that of a more generalized level, determined by our culturally instituted modes of symbolic identity. It is only by the latter's overriding of the directive signs of the former that our experience of being human, both as symbolic I and as a we based on symbolic and therefore artificial modes of kinship, can be enabled. An example: soldiers who fight today's national wars and who must be prepared to die in defense of the flag might very well be tempted as individuals by the genetic imperative to save themselves. Yet, given the enculturation process of school and home and the social order in general, the genetic imperative is so automatically overridden that it can scarcely be heard. When, in addition, Bosnian Serbs fight and kill Bosnian Muslims, or vice versa, or when Tutsis kill Hutus, or vice versa, therefore, they do so as subjects enculturated in the terms of their specific group identities. It does not matter that, as in the case of the Tutsis and Hutus, they all speak the same language. The positivism of linguistic identity is not the issue here. Rather, the issue is that of narrative representations, of the symbolic identities to which they give rise, and of the systems of domination and counter-domination to which their respective group narcissism impels them. Given that such identities and modes of symbolic kinship/non-kinship are experienced by their socialized subjects in no less cognitively and affectively closed and therefore narcissistic a manner than are the purely genetically determined modes of conspecificity of organic species. The fundamental hypothesis of our proposed new conceptual ground and world outlook, therefore, is that if the ritual ceremony of symbolic birth, as conceptualized by the Sirah of Chad, enables us to grasp the mechanism by which Grassie's governing code was and is structured and inscripted as the condition of the first emergence, and thereby of the instituting of human forms of life, as a hybridly bio/logos, nature/culture level of existence, it also enables us to understand the nature of the price that had to be paid for the rupture effected by such forms of life, as a hybridly bio/logos, nature/culture level of existence. It also enables us to understand the nature of the price that had to be paid for the rupture effected by such forms of life, with the genetically determined directive signs that motivate and necessitate the behaviors of purely organic life. This price, one that explains inter alia the law-like nature of the gallery of mirrors/representations of Africa and of all peoples of African descent in the scholarly and cinematic texts of the West, is that of our having to remain hitherto subordinated to the directive signs generated from the narratively inscribed codes of symbolic life and death, signs which now function to motivate and necessitate our human behaviors in the terms of culture-specific fields defined by the self-referentiality of the code, and thereby by the cognitive and affective closure to which this self-referentiality leads. How, nevertheless, is this motivation of behaviors by the negative/positive representations and or directive signs of Grassie's code concretely affected? The answer lies in the recent discovery by biologists and neuroscientists of what they identify as the opiate biochemical reward and punishment system of the brain, and of the ways in which this system functions as the centrally directive mechanisms which serves to both motivate and necessitate the behaviors of all organic species. As Avram Goldstein explains in a recent book, for all forms of organic life, a species-specific opioid system functions to signal reward on the one hand and punishment on the other. In all cases, the feel-good reward signal is effected by the euphoria-inducing chemical event, which, as Goldstein argues, is an event that is probably defined by the activating of beta endorphins, while the feel-bad punishment signal is induced by the activating of dynorphins. We can therefore speculate, he continues, that the reward systems function to drive adaptive behaviors the following way. They signal good when food is found and eaten by a hungry animal, when water is found and drunk by a thirsty animal, when sexual activity is promised and consummated, when a threatening situation is averted. They signal bad when harmful behavior is engaged in or when pain is experienced. These signals become associated with the situation in which they are generated, and they are remembered. Here we approach the central role played by the negatively/positively marked representations, as in the case of the menstrual blood/tobacco smoke representations of the Chadian narrative, or as in that of the Africa/Europe binarily opposed iconography of Western cinematic texts, and the artificial motivation systems that drive human behaviors. For if the reward system is central to the genetic motivation system, or GMS, by which the animal learns to seek what is beneficial and to avoid what is harmful, and therefore by means of which the behaviors appropriate to each species are law-likely induced, this delicately regulated system, Goldstein continues, was perfected by evolution over millions of years to serve the survival of all species, and to let us humans experience pleasure and satisfaction from the biologically appropriate behaviors and situations of daily life. Nevertheless, as the biologist Danieli proposes, in contradiction to Goldstein in this respect, there is a fundamental difference in the case of the humans. For not only are the behaviors to be induced here intended to be culturally rather than biologically appropriate behaviors, but in the case of the humans, Danieli suggests, where the altruistic behaviors essential to social cohesion must be verbally, semantically induced, it is discursive processes, i.e. origin narratives, ideology, or belief systems, and their respective systems of negatively/positively marked representations, which serve to activate, in culturally relative and recoded terms, the functioning of the human biochemical reward and punishment mechanism, thereby motivating our always culture-specific ensemble of behaviors. With this consequence that the kind of generalized altruism needed as the integrating mechanism of each social order must be as consistently rewarded through the mediation of positively marked representations as must be the criterion of symbolic life, who no less positive marking functions to induce in the order's subjects the desire to realize being in the terms which also make possible the display of kin-recognizing behaviors towards those socialized into subjectivity in the same terms as themselves, those with whom each I constitutes a symbolic we. Each such criterion of the normal subject can itself be realized and experienced as a value criterion. However, only through the mediating process of the negatively marked category, which is made to embody the signifier of symbolic death, in terms that are the antithesis of those of normal beings, as the category, therefore, of deviant otherness or of difference from which the bonding principles of sameness or fake similarity is generated. If, therefore, every human mode of life, every human mode of being and its form of life is instituted about a governing code or representation of symbolic life, the TSRU, and death, MBFD, which then functions to regulate in verbally recoded terms the functioning of the opiate reward and punishment systems of the brain, thereby enabling our human behaviors to be governed by the learned or acquired motivational system specific to each local culture. Then the behaviors so induced are everywhere behaviors appropriate to the specific code instituted by each cultural system in its founding. Origin narrative. In consequence, where for all purely organic species it is the biochemical event of reward and punishment which directly motivates and is causal of each species' ensemble behaviors, the fundamental distinction for human forms of life is that it is the culture representational event which motivates and is causal of by means of the functioning of the opiate reward / punishment system which it verbally recodes our uniquely human behaviors. The issue of the systematically negative representation of Africa in both the Western cinematic text as well as in the scholarly text can therefore be recognized as a function of the enacting of the governing code of symbolic life and death, which is instituting of our present criterion / conception of being man, and thereby of the basic principles of understanding of our contemporary global culture, that of the West in its bourgeois and biocentric conception. While, since in the case of all human forms of life, it is the representational event, as in the case of those given rise to by the Western cinematic text, which gives rise to the biochemical event, whether to that of the beta endorphin event activated by the positively marked representation of man as iconicized in the signifier of the Indo-European physiognomy, or that of the dynorphin event activated by the negatively marked representation of man's human other, as iconicized by the Bantu-type physiognomy of peoples of African descent. Then the calling into question and countering by the African cinematic text from Sembeni onwards of these dynorphin activating representations of Africa and of the peoples of African descent is a calling into question of the governing symbolic code enacting of man, and therefore of our present ethnoclass conception of the human, man, itself. Yet, however, a calling into question that has necessarily remained tentative and provisional, since having to be carried out within the terms of our present way of knowing center, and thereby outside as yet a conceptual ground in whose reference frame or world outlook human forms of life, together with their respective governing codes of symbolic life, and thereby of symbolic kinship and eusociality, will be able to exist as objects of knowledge and to be thereby fully theorizable. This is very much the same way as biological life itself would only come to exist as an object of knowledge and be thereby theorizable, as Foucault points out, only within the then new conceptual ground elaborated by the fundamental rearrangement of knowledge that took place at the end of the 18th century and during the 19th, as a rearrangement which provided the new way of knowing or order of knowledge needed to inscribe our present figure of man, together with the ethnoclass conception of the human as an evolutionary selected and purely biologized being, which ostensibly pre-exists the culture and governing code that can alone inscript and enact it as such a mode of being human. We can therefore put forward the following hypotheses: that ruling groups in all human cultures, including our own, are ruling groups to the extent that they embody their respective culture's optimal criterion of being, or code of symbolic life. That therefore the great transformations in history are always transformations of the code, of what it means to be human, and therefore of the poesis of being and mode of symbolic conspecificity, of which the code is the organizing principle. A transformation, therefore, of the always symbolically coded modes of consciousness integrating of our human orders and their forms of life